To understand racism in today's society, you have to understand white privilege in America, which requires you to understand the history of white privilege. Many people feed into the propaganda, the marketing, advertising, and the media, the music, the stereotypes, but they don't actually sit down and understand the history of white privilege in America. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed mortgage loans of everyday American citizens. 98% of every approved mortgage application were given to white families that reside in white cities, white areas in America. Only 2% of every mortgage application that was approved were given to someone who was black or white living in a predominantly black or mixed area. Between 1934 to 1962, that is over 20 years of applications. Only 2% were given to anyone who pretty much lived in a mixed area. That's a part of white privilege. Because right there, the starting line was so one-sided that blacks, the minorities, we weren't granted the same starting point. So we had to scratch and claw and fight at a lower stance than those who were white in America. Off the bat. Meaning, in 1940, the average house was around $6,000. In 1938, minimum wage was created at 25 cents. That is $10 a week. By 1940, it was up 30 cents. So that's what? $12 a week was the average salary of a minimum wage employee in 1940. Try to follow this. So therefore, if people who purchase homes, brand new homes in 1940, their houses were paid off by 1980 when minimum wage was around like $3 and plus cents an hour. Their homes were paid off by 1980. Meaning, by 2015, those who still had their houses in their family were able to pass those homes down to their children. And then their children could pass those off to their children. So you have people who have houses in their family going on 3 generations. Where the house started off being sold at $6,000, that's now being sold for $500,000 and $600,000. 300 grand, 200 grand, depending on the area and how well they were maintained. But here's the more important part. I just told you the federal government were backing loans for whites who lived in white neighborhoods. So a lot of these homes in the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. The 60s, homes were being sold for like an average around 12 grand. By 1980, houses were going for like $70,000. That's how quick the inflation really took off in America. But as I digress, what that means is that a lot of these homes that are built in the 40s were built in all white neighborhoods, and a lot of these areas stayed all white. They stayed upper class because as the market changed and growth was created, these homes were already locked in white areas. So minorities, blacks, we couldn't afford these homes in the areas because we didn't make the kind of money required to go ahead and take over those loans. On top of, paying the original homeowner something extra for the troubles of, the profit margin, whatever. So we couldn't afford it anyway. So a lot of these homes stayed in all white neighborhoods. So therefore, a lot of these homes that are now being sold for $500,000, $300,000, $400,000, $700,000, or even $1 million that were built in 1940 for $6,000. People are able to profit and reprofit and profit off of white privilege. because the home stayed in their family for 70 years, 60 years. That's a part of white privilege. Other part of white privilege is this: minimum wage was like 30-40 cents in America throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Or I think by 62, it was up to like $1.12 an hour was minimum wage, give or take. So for a good 20 years, minimum wage wasn't even $1. So you have minorities, and then in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, blacks were not known for going to college and getting degrees and becoming CEOs and CEOs or doctors or lawyers. We didn't really have those kind of advances overall. We were a real minority. It wasn't 40 million of us in 1940. Our population was not that strong, so we were already a true minority in this country. And the fact that we didn't have the equal education or upper education as those who were white that could afford to go to college, that could afford to get higher education, we had to depend on blue-collar work. Carpentry and working in factories and machine operating, things of that nature, assembly line kind of work. Or our women were able to become nurses, wiping asses for a living. They didn't have the privilege of becoming the RNs and the doctors or the lawyers or your financial officers, your accountants, your executives. We were not allowed those same kind of advancements. So when America decided to open the borders and allow American-based companies to close those factories and companies in the inner cities, the retail stores, the locations in the inner cities, and take them overseas or take them into upper class areas, depriving us of the ability to feed ourselves and take care of our families, once again that crippled us. Because we didn't have the education, or we weren't accepted in the boys clubs to go ahead and get the advancement needed to make a decent wage to feed ourselves. So once again, we're starting at a lower point. We already can't afford the homes because we can't get mortgages for them. So we're stuck to rent. We're stuck to have a landlord. We're not allowed to have our own. And if we do, it's harder for us to have our own. Then our jobs are taken away from us, while the federal government makes a kickback, taxes, import tax by having American-based companies go overseas and then ship their products back to America. They get tax breaks for depriving us in the inner cities of having our jobs. So now we don't even have money to really feed ourselves or take care of ourselves because our jobs have been taken. Which didn't just affect blacks, it affected a lot of people who were lower class in America. Then we had our civil rights movement. We had the fight for equality in the South. Okay, after that happened, we had the crack epidemic, and as I just finished stating, we didn't own homes, so we damn sure didn't own planes. So we didn't smuggle the drugs, the crack, the cocaine to America, the opiates, the heroin. That was not us smuggling the shit into our country. But yet it invades our community, which forced a lot of black men and black women to get into the drug game. Why? Because they had to feed themselves, which kind of backfired on America, because what was used to target black communities spread over to white communities, and white drugs became popular, and whites coming to black neighborhoods spending that cash that they worked so hard for drugs. So we started to profit off of drugs, and then our women started to profit off of prostitution, which then went and entwined with the drug game, because then some of them were selling their ass just to feed their addiction. Which still goes to show the dynamic of white privilege compared to where we started from and what was invaded and given to us. If you look at American history, if you look at when we first came over here, when the Europeans first came over to America, they got rid of the Native Americans by giving them smallpox. So The same Europeans who were once known for killing and wiping out an entire fucking race of people in America to take over this land. It's the same European Americans that had no problem poisoning black communities with drugs. But yet people say, hey, because you're black, you're this and you're that. Oh, black people are so violent. Black people don't have anything. Because we are accustomed to not having anything. And we're not accustomed to having anything because of what? White privilege in America. You know, that's not to say that we are not responsible for, in 2015, being educated and being aware of the history that our people have endured and changing and doing better and overcoming the obstacles that we have been faced to suffer from. We still have that ability to change, but this is the history and this is why we are where we're at. So it started with the real estate, it started with employment, and then it changed. Oh, then they went to drugs. And then as drugs hit, you know, you started having younger families, younger women having children, you know, younger men making a living by selling drugs, getting fucking killed and murdered. And then it hit jail. In jails, if you look back at American history with prison, you gotta realize a few different things. One, look back at chain gangs. America used to take prisoners, inmates, convicts, and then use them as free labor to make the state money, which in return made the federal government money. They would take inmates and then they would contract them out to different developers to do manual labor as a way to compensate for having to house them, feed them, clothe them. But more importantly, it made the state money hand over fist. As a result, it helped put smaller companies out of business that could not compete with the contractual structure that a prison was allowed to contract at. So pretty much a prison could pretty much underbid every contractor because they had free labor. No matter how dangerous or how tough a job was, they can outbid because they didn't have to pay a person an actual wage that was substantial to anything that a normal person could live off of. You fast forward 2015, now companies have privatized. And privatized prisons do the same thing that chain gangs used to do, except they do it on a larger scale. Now privatized prisons contract with major corporations to have inmates in these prisons work for major corporations as a subsidiary. No, I'm sorry, not as a subsidiary, as a contractor. So, like Victoria's Secret one, you think like 2001, Victoria's Secrets had inmates, you know, shipping for them, you know, making boxes, like shipping materials out. Other companies had companies doing packaging. You know, major companies are allowing privatized prisons, which is nothing more than a corporation, to be able to underbid temp agencies. We don't even have to hire temp agencies because we can just hire inmates. Now, if you look at this issue, you take privatized prisons all across America that now have contracts with states that require them to keep their prisons populated at all times with a certain percent. Some are 60%, some are 70%, some are 90% full at all times. And if a state cannot keep those beds full of free labor, the privatized prison then charges the states excessive dollars as a penalty for failing on their contractual agreements. If you go one step forward, you look over the last 10 to 15 years, how many laws have become mandatory prison time if found guilty? Do the math. Privatized prisons charge states X amount of dollars if prisons aren't full to a certain percentage. In return, states are now saying if you're found guilty of excess crime, you are now being hit with mandatory prison time. longer the prison term, the less they have to worry about keeping prisoners in prison the less a state has to worry about filling those beds because they have long-term residents, long-term employees in those prisons now. Over the last 15-20 years, how many laws have been put on book to circumvent prior laws that were on book that required a state to prove a person's guilt? You know, you should have to prove a person committed a crime. Then they had conspiracy, and then they had, you know, your fuck due process. We're going to throw due process. We're going to fuck over due process. What we're going to do is, instead of having to prove your guilt, we have to prove just substantial evidence, preponderance of evidence that suggests you could have done it, which is also called circumstantial evidence. Hell, we can't really prove we did it, but we have a good feeling that our evidence will support it. We maybe did it, which is enough to get us conviction, which is enough to fill those prisons in those privatized sectors with enough inmates to fill those beds. And if you cannot get those convictions, what states are doing, they now transfer inmates from state prisons to the privatized sectors to make up the difference between what they cannot get convictions on. In exchange, privatized prisons are able to fulfill the workload and work orders they have from corporate companies, and are able to make their money not only from the state but also from the corporate companies that are paying them to have their employees, aka inmates, do said job. And this is just a portion of white privilege in America, because in America there are black crimes, there are white crimes. And I say black and white crimes, I mean there are crimes that are done predominantly by blacks, and sometimes those crimes have a longer and stiffer prison sentence. You know, this is why things like stop and frisk is so fucked up in America, because you can stop and frisk a person for no fucking reason at all, find something, or create a situation where a person reacts inappropriately, which gets them locked up in the first place, which can result in a person having severe prison sentences, which allow the private sector to have a new employee to put on payroll, which still creates a situation that privatized prisons and prisons in general that contract inmates are putting small businesses out of business, because people cannot compete with the selling point that a prison can go ahead and contract out, because their inmates are their employees, and the employees will work for nothing, and they have no option because they're prisoners. They don't have any rights anymore. And this is just part of the insanity of white privilege, and how we as a society have gotten where we have gotten. But people don't want to do their homework. They don't want to research. They don't want to do the time to take the due diligence to see what's real, what's fake. You know, if you look at the music industry by itself, when rap first came out, it wasn't hardcore, it wasn't gangster. Gangster rap became gangster rap because a reporter, back when NWA was out, a reporter decided to say, this is gangster rap. These are gangsters. These are criminals. These are thugs. Ice Cube and NWA and Dr. Dre and Eazy, they did not create gangster rap. They didn't call it gangster rap. It was conscious rap. They were talking about the streets and, you know, what they had to endure on a daily basis. A journalist decided it was more marketable to call it gangster rap. Then the music producers and not producers, executives at music companies decided to take that image and keep selling it, which in return created some of the very chaos we see on our streets with our youth. Beefs and violence and drug use, and the promotion from music and movies of black culture is always in a negative light more times than not, and it feeds into the youth's head and increase that downward path that leads to prison, that leads to privatized companies making money off of blacks while they're in jail, and then when they come home, the same companies that they were once working for as contracted worker under the penal system is no longer allowed to get hired for said company because that company does not hire inmates. Or I'm sorry, that company does not hire those who have convictions of felonies. Do you see the fucking ignorance of the revolving door that we are faced with on a daily basis? And this is why I have a personal issue when I see companies saying we don't hire inmates, but they'll contract or privatize prisons. Or when I see people saying, hey, blacks are this, or that, or this, but you came from a good home, and your home that you came from profited off of white privilege. So how dare you attack someone who is